Now, we would like to invite all of you to our first session of the forum, a framework for transition towards the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. In this part of the session, we will have an overview of how science, including social sciences, among others, could better support planning, policymaking, implementation, and monitoring, as well as a presentation of the present goals, targets, and indicators in the draft Global Biodiversity Framework. The keynote speakers will be delivered, the keynote presentations will be delivered by Sir Robert Watson, Mrs. Maria Hernandez, and Mr. Francis Ogwal. Once all the presentations are done, we will open the floor for Q&As. Please use the questions and answers tab at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. The chat tab will be used for housekeeping announcements to attendees. Attendees should not use the chat tab for submitting questions to the panel, please. At the end of the three presentations, we will select as many questions as possible for the Q&A round. Since only a limited number of questions can be addressed during the live session, panelists may also respond in writing in the Zoom Q&A tab during the session. The unanswered questions will be reposted on the forum website. Such virtual space will remain open for 3 days after the end of each session to give an opportunity for the panelists and attendees to consider the remaining questions and for the online discussions to continue. First, I would like to invite Sir Robert Watson to make his presentation on the key findings of the UNEP Global Synthesis Report on recent major assessments. Sir Robert Watson was leader for UNEP's first synthesis reports, Making Peace with Nature, a scientific blueprint to tackle climate, biodiversity, and pollution emergencies. And he is one of the most influential environmental scientists worldwide. Sir Watson, you have the floor.
What I want to talk about today is the key findings from Making Peace with Nature. The next slide simply shows that this report is based on 25 of the major assessments that have been performed in the last 5 to 10 years. IPCC, IPBES, GEO, IRP, Chemicals Outlook 2. 50 leading experts around the world prepare this document. And what we've basically shown is the environmental challenges have grown significantly since the Stockholm Conference in 1972. The next slide quickly summarizes how we are transforming humankind's relationship with nature. Trade has grown tenfold. The global economy has grown fivefold. World population has doubled. In many ways, this is good. Average prosperity has doubled. But 1.3 billion people remain poor and 700 million remain hungry. This resource-intensive development model degrades and surpasses Earth's finite capacity to sustain human well-being. We must restore and adapt Earth's capacity. The coming decade is crucial and the challenge is systemic. The next slide shows how wildlife, once the dominant biomass on Earth for mammals, is now only 5% of the biomass. We humans are about 1/3 of the biomass of mammals, and domesticated animals are about 2/3. The next slide shows our production of energy. It's tripled in the last 50 years. As you can see from this slide, a small amount of biomass really hasn't changed for about 100 years, but then a great increase in the use of coal, oil, natural gas. We need to transform our energy system away from the use of fossil fuel and transform it to use modern renewable energies for everybody. The next slide talks about the transformation of the land and our oceans. 3/4 of our ice-free land has been transformed. We've lost native forests, grasslands, wetlands. We've transformed them into roads, infrastructure, agriculture, livestock rearing. In fact, 1/4 of our land has been radically transformed, and all of the projections suggest that by 2050, there'll only be about 10% of land that has not been transformed by human actions. And in addition, 2/3 of the ocean has been significantly transformed. The next slide shows how chemical use has gone up tremendously in the last 60 years. This shows total chemical use in pink. But if you look at the use of nitrogen fertilizers, the use of pesticide, significant increases in the last 60 years. This has increased agricultural production, which has been needed for food security. But much of these chemicals, the fertilizers, the pesticides, they run off from the land into rivers, into the lakes, and into coastal zones. They eutrify these systems. And in fact, we have 400 dead zones around the world today. The next slide shows how greenhouse gas emissions have increased considerably in the last 30 years, predominantly from fossil fuels CO2, but also methane, nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases. The world has already warmed 1 degree in the last 100 years. Sea level rise is accelerating, thermal expansion of the ocean, melting of ice sheets. We're seeing more frequent and intense extreme events, heat waves, floods, droughts. All of these threaten people and nature. The next slide then shows how the risks that we thought 20 years ago are much more severe. IPCC has the burning embers diagram. They look at unique and threatened ecosystems, the implications of extreme weather events, how impacts of climate change are distributed, where poor people are much more affected than the middle class and the rich. We look at the aggregate effects at a global level and large-scale discontinuities, so things like the West Antarctic ice sheet, permafrost. And what you can see is the bottom dotted line in each is the transition from undetectable change to moderate threat. The line above it dotted is as we transform from moderate threat to high risk. And as you can see, relative to the TAR 2002 to the present day SR 1.5, we're seeing these transitions at lower and lower temperatures. In other words, we underestimated the risk of climate change 20 years ago. It's much more severe than we thought. The next slide talks about the risks to biodiversity. The challenges are land and sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. For terrestrial and freshwater systems, it is land use change that is the biggest threat, followed by direct exploitation. For the marine ecosystems, it is overfishing. Direct exploitation is the biggest threat. While climate change isn't the biggest threat to date, if we don't meet the Paris targets of limiting climate change to less than 2 degrees Celsius, climate change could be the biggest threat to biodiversity of all drivers in the next coming decades. 1 million of the world's estimated 8 million plants and species are already threatened with extinction. We're seeing significant drops in population sizes and abundances. Ecosystems are being degraded, and ecosystem services, especially the regulating services and the cultural services, are already being eroded. The next slide shows, unfortunately, that none of the Aichi targets have been fully met. 2 independent analyses, IPBES and GBO5, actually analyze every one of the 20 targets. Yellow suggests we've made some progress towards the targets, but we never fully reached them. And red suggests we actually made almost limited progress, and in some cases, we've actually gone back. The next slide shows how all of these environmental emergencies are intertwined. Climate change is affected by land degradation and biodiversity loss. In turn, climate change affects land degradation and biodiversity. Equally, biodiversity is affected by land degradation and vice versa. And all of these issues affect human well-being. The key message here is the environmental emergencies are intertwined. We need to develop action plans to look at each of these issues in conjunction. We need at COP15 and at COP26 common targets, common goals, and harmonized actions. The next slide talks about how the SDGs are really quite threatened. Next slide, please. How the SDGs are threatened. What you see on the bottom is the basis of the wedding cake: climate change, loss of biodiversity, marine and terrestrial. If we do not address these issues of environmental loss, we will not succeed in meeting any of the SDGs. We will weaken food and water security. We'll hamper all efforts to make our cities and communities sustainable. We will not be able to meet the challenge of poverty elimination. We cannot become a more equitable society. Our economies will be threatened and human health will be threatened. There's no question that climate change in 2018, simply from weather-related disasters, cost $155 billion. 3.2 billion people are adversely affected today by land degradation, and pollution causes 9 million premature deaths annually, a combination of indoor and outdoor air pollution. The next slide shows that we've really got an equity issue. It's the rich industrialized countries that have caused the problem, but it's the marginalized and poor people in developing countries that are most vulnerable to any of these pollution emergencies, climate, biodiversity loss, or pollution. The next slide says we can transform humankind's relationship with nature. This is the key to a sustainable future. Human knowledge, ingenuity, technology, and cooperation can transform our societies and economies, and we can secure a sustainable future. But it will involve a fundamental change in the technological, economic, social organization of society. We have to reconsider our worldviews, our norms, our values, our governance. What constitutes a good life? We need major shifts in investments and regulations. These are the key to a just and informed transformation. We need to overcome the inertia and opposition from vested interests that have a stake in the status quo. And COVID-19 could provide an impetus to accelerate these transformative change with new economic recovery packages. But the key message is all of these emergencies are interconnected and they need to be addressed together to achieve sustainability. The next slide, unfortunately, shows we have a major challenge of addressing climate change. If we want to be on a pathway to less than 2 degrees Celsius, as is indicated in the Paris Climate Agreement, to be on a 1.5 degree pathway, we need to reduce current emissions by 45% in the coming decade by 2030, net zero by 2050. If we only want to achieve 2 degrees Celsius, we still have to reduce emissions by 25% by 2030, reach net zero by around 2070. The trouble is all projections show that emissions in 2030 with the current pledges under the Paris Agreement will be the same as today, no lower than today. Therefore, we need to strengthen the pledges significantly. We are not on a pathway to 1.5 to 2. We are currently on a pathway of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, a disaster for biodiversity and human well-being. The next slide says we need a complement of actions if we want to protect and restore life on Earth. We need conservation and restoration. We need to address land and sea use, overexploitation, climate pollution, invasive alien species, and we need sustainable production and reduced consumption. We need all of them simultaneously. And the next slide shows a major challenge. We need to transform our economic, financial, and productive system. If we do that, we can shift to a sustainable world. As Partha Dasgupta said in his recent report, we need to include natural capital in decision-making through inclusive wealth. GDP does not measure sustainable economic growth. We need natural capital to give us the clue on sustainability. We need to eliminate environmental harmful subsidies, and we need to invest in a transition to a sustainable future. We need to move away from financing fossil fuels, unsustainable agriculture, and we need to redirect some of the fossil fuel, agriculture, fisheries, and transport subsidies into sustainable practices. The next slide shows that we need to recognize that the food, water, and energy systems must be dealt with together. You cannot look at these productive systems independently. So we have to look at these. How do they work together? We need to recognize that while we need to transition to a low carbon economy in both the production and the use of energy, if we move to a more plant-based diet, that has a significant potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, anywhere from 2 to 20%. If we really think about energy efficiency, we can save trillions of dollars per year. And the real key is keeping our planet healthy. The next slide discusses, in essence, what we're seeing today with COVID-19. 75% of all new infectious diseases have their origins in animals. There are 700,000 potential viruses in animals and birds that could pose a threat to human health. We need to reduce the risk of a future pandemic, and we need to respond to a future pandemic in a much more coordinated way. We need to reduce deforestation. We need to reduce our human impact with wild animals. We need to reduce our livestock's impact with wild animals, and we need far more hygienic wet markets. And the last slide simply said, we need all actors to play their role. Governments need to lead. There's no question about that. They need to lead with good policies and good legislation. But we need the financial organizations, the private sector, NGOs, individuals, intergovernmental organizations, and the science community. All of us have a role to play in addressing these challenges of the environmental emergencies, the transformation of our economic and financial systems, and the way we transfer our food, water, and energy. The bottom line is climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution. They are environmental issues, but they are economic issues, development issues, security issues, moral, ethical, and social issues. And we need to deal with them today. We cannot afford to wait. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sir Watson, for this very insightful presentation. Reminder, the participants, that if you have questions, you can post them in the Q&A tab. And at the end of the 3 keynote presentations, we will have some time for a Q&A round. Now, I'm pleased to invite Ms. Ana Maria Hernandez, Chair of IPBES, to deliver her presentation. Ms. Hernandez has experience in international environmental law and negotiations and is an expert in the science policy interface. She previously worked at the Humboldt Institute in Colombia and the Ministry of Environment in Colombia, among other roles. Ana Maria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Brita, and thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. And I'm really happy, you know, that to see my colleagues who co-organized the Science Policy Forum for Biodiversity and the Conference of Sustainability Science, because we pulled this together some years ago, and this is a wonderful initiative which will have very good messages to the next conference of the parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Well, today I want to share with you some reflections about the importance of science policy dialogue to reach common and urgent biodiversity goals. And of course, based in our IPBES global assessment and based on all the information that already Bob presented, my first reflection arises from a basic sentence that we continually forget, and is that we all depend on biodiversity and the contributions it makes to us. We all are part of nature. So some data identified by the experts of the IPBES global assessment and the secondary information collected, and also the data that already presented by Bob related to total interaction of man with nature. For example, more than 2 billion people depends on wood to generate energy. 4 billion depends on nature, natural medicine, and 75 of food crops, including fruits and vegetables that we eat every day, depend on pollination. So biodiversity provides us vital support permanently every day. But even though the very existence of human beings, of all of us, depends on that biodiversity and ecosystem services, in a contradictory way, it is our own actions that have dramatically decreased biodiversity. For example, the IPBES Global Assessment noted that the 75% of the Earth's surface has been significantly altered, or the 85% of the wetlands have disappeared, and 66% of the surface of the oceans is experiencing high impacts, generating pressures never seen before at all levels of biodiversity. So, taking that into consideration, my second reflection arises from the level of importance we give to that information, to all the data and the knowledge that we collect at the scientific and practical level. The science made clear that the diversity within a species, between species, and of ecosystems, as well as many fundamental contributions we derive from nature, are declining fast. And yes, this is the fact. We cannot say that does not exist. And as you know, the IPBES Global Assessment point out the 5 main direct drivers of change in nature. And I will repeat what Bob said. We have to remember that those are the changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation of organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. But those 5 direct drivers result from an array of underlying causes, what we call the indirect drivers of change. That includes production and consumption patterns, for example, or human population dynamics and trends, or trade, or technological innovations and local through global governance, which are in turn underpinned by societal values and behaviors. In general, the direct and indirect causes of biodiversity loss have been diagnosed at different scales. We know the problems. This is important. We have scientific information, although it's not all the information maybe, but we have information. Unfortunately, the measures taken to date have not been sufficiently or ambitious or comprehensive and actionable to solve the problems and to achieve sustainability. Although, of course, there are many efforts, and we have to recognize the hard work done by people, by organizations and governments at different levels. Unfortunately, these actions are not sufficient. The clarity of the information provided should guide us to a clear actions that could be taken at different spatial and temporal scales. But really, we need actionable, ambitious actions, those capable to slow the curve of biodiversity loss, addressing the drivers, of course, of change, but especially, I want to call you to pay special attention to the underlying causes. There is no room for status quo excuses, but now this is a wonderful time. We have a wonderful window to innovate and transform with new solutions coming from and with the society. And regarding that, or talking about the society, my third point here is come with other question: who cares about this? And the easy and normal answer generally goes to the government or to the ministers in charge of the environmental affairs. But as we all know very well, loss of biodiversity is not only an environmental issue, but also a developmental, economic, security, social, and even a moral issue as well. And it impacts all the sectors and all aspects of society. In that sense, what we call transformative change can be achieved only if there is a common understanding of the problems or challenges that the loss of biodiversity, together with the problems that we have to address regarding climate change, desertification, and ocean alterations, present to the humanity, and we can find cooperative efforts to resolve them. Look, in my own perspective, of course, the exercise of rethinking ourselves and changes this business as usual scenario is urgent. Every one of us is co-responsible of the health of the planet and of our own survival. Now, I want to reflect on the real incorporation of science in decision-making. And it's good to speak clearly because nothing is perfect. And there are huge gaps in the respectful dialogue that must exist, and not only between different sciences. You know that sometimes the natural sciences do not talk a lot with the social sciences or with the economic and political ones. But we have to talk between these different sciences, between this different branch of sciences and other forms of knowledge and practices, such as the indigenous and local knowledge, and between all of those knowledges, systems of knowledge, and the practices of those who make decisions. The lack of dialogue and inclusion needs to be addressed. An important challenge then is to listen with respect and learn how to incorporate the different knowledge systems. Solid, transparent, and open science can serve as a basis for political decisions in all its stages. But really, nothing that science says is feasible if the society in general, and who takes decision cannot reach that science, or do not understand, or do not take into account the science. So, as Ezequiel Benitez said also, we have to talk with a clear language. Then the challenge at a global level within the framework of a political space is to base discussions and decisions on the best, solid, credible, and transparent scientific information on biodiversity, including, of course, the causes and consequences of human actions on it. And it is our responsibility, together, all of us, to provide that information, data, and knowledge, and know how to communicate well this information. And my final reflection is about the future. And we cannot give a standard recipe or solution. And of course, we can build based on proposals for action. IPBES, as you know, suggested a series of levers and leverage points to trigger a truly transformative change by tackling the underlying indirect drivers of nature deterioration, ideally to implement across and between all sectors. Then the systemic integration of different sectors will catalyze this wheel of transformative change. This is what we call mainstreaming. And then the next challenge facing a global biodiversity framework is inclusion. And this inclusion is based on cooperation and intersectoral and interinstitutional work in a way to change our approach towards a sustainable future. Finally, I want to highlight that the IPBES 2030 rolling program of work approved by our 7th plenary will address some assessments, new assessments. One of those is the nexus assessment between biodiversity and sustainable development goals. Other one is about underlying causes of biodiversity loss and transformative changes. Other one is about business and biodiversity. Just for taking pay more some examples, but those will give really clear information to support from knowledge, the challenges mentioned today. Scientific knowledge can lead great changes for a better future, but the way in which networks, dialogues, and communications are generated really makes all the difference whether it is achieved or not. This forum, and I'm very happy, that's why I'm very happy to be here, is a fantastic example on how science can be inclusive, can be open, can be transparent, and above all, can be transformative to generate solid interface between knowledge and decision-making. So congratulations and thank you very much for inviting IPBES to participate.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. Now, Mr. Francis Ogwal, co-chair of the open-ended working group for the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and Natural Resources Manager for the National Environment Management Authority of Uganda, will make his presentation about an overview of the proposed Global Biodiversity Framework, including its goals, targets, and indicators. Mr. Ogwal, The floor is yours.
So thank you so much, the previous two speakers. You've really touched on quite a lot, on a number of things that you'll be hearing how we are trying to address them in the post-2020. Those were very insightful presentation that I've had. So I will be making this presentation on behalf of the co-chairs, my co-chair Basil, who is not able to be with us today, but we did make this presentation together. So just to let you know that there is a basis on which we are working on when it comes to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. First of all, of course, there's a COP decision that empowered the co-chairs to undertake this, but also most importantly that the Aichi biodiversity targets, which was adopted in 2010 and ran from 2011 to 2020, has actually come to the end, but unfortunately, it shows that we have not achieved those targets, all the 20 targets. That is the sad news that is there. So when you hear the presentation that was made by the previous Professor Robert, I think you'll see that actually what he's talking is reality, because nature is in decline. So only other targets partially were achieved. Target 9, invasive species, target 11, protected areas, 16 on Nagoya Protocol, 17 on NBSAPs, and then target 20 on resource mobilization. The situation, of course, got worse at the national level, where it was noted that although some progress was made, but still it is also insufficient to achieve those targets as well. So the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is taking into account the lessons that we've learned from implementing the Aichi Biodiversity Targets 2011-2020. So the situation, as you've just seen from the presentations that were made, things are not good. Everything is in decline, as you've seen, but also the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 has clearly indicated that. But fortunately, we still believe there's a chance to put things right, put things back on track. And therefore, in the development of this framework, we have got some overriding arching principles. There are 13 of them. You can see that part which talks about participatory, inclusive, gender responsive, and so forth. But you'll see in there that we are talking about knowledge-based, transformative, comprehensive, among others. So this process alone really takes into account and recognizes the role of science, as you'll be seeing when I go along. So the framework itself is not only for either scientists or we in the CBD or those that are interested so much on biodiversity, but for everyone. Because as you've heard, biodiversity is the basis for which we are surviving on this planet. Without it, we wouldn't be here. So it is a framework that will be for everyone. So you've heard about some of those principles that were being talked about. You've had colleagues who have just been present talking about transformative change. So this post-2020 process also aims at mobilizing broad societal engagement to achieve accelerated and sustainable transformation, to implement the 3 objectives of the CBD, where biodiversity and ecosystem services are recognized as essential infrastructure for really life on this planet, including us, of course, human beings. And that is also a very important aspect when it comes to making sustainable development agenda, achieving sustainable development agenda. We cannot do that without really aiming at having some transformative change happening. So when it comes to the knowledge-based, the process will be based on the best available science and evidence. And thank you so much, the previous speaker that talked about, making peace with nature. He has really uncovered so many things. I really got, touched by his presentation. So there's a lot that science has to play in the framing of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, but also we are going to be taking into account, of course, other social sciences, local traditional knowledge, and citizen science as we move along with working on this framework. So in terms of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, please, we would like you to take note that the negotiation for the text of this framework is actually done at the open-ended working group. But we have got the subsidiary bodies under the CBD. We have SABSTA, and we have got SBI. Those and other technical arms are formed under the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, the one on the Cartagena Protocol. They provide a lot of input that we use to inform the process. So we have got SABSTA, whose mandate basically from the second meeting of the working group will be to look at the completeness of these targets and goals. We're talking about overlaps if they're there, the indicators, which indicators are we going to use, availability of baseline data, but also advise on the linkage to SDGs. We've heard about this from the previous speakers, that actually SDGs will not be achieved with this environmental degradation going on. And I think that is a message that should really go, and we keep emphasizing, because people are dreaming so big on the other side and degrading on this side. Now, how can those two really complement each other? Degradation cannot help you achieve sustainable development goals. So of course, there are other agenda items and SABSTA 24 that will still be relevant for the post-2020. And those, if you go to the website, you can see them, and they are going to be considered to give us information that helps us to frame or update the framework itself. The next slide. I was talking about the subsidiary body on implementation. And for it, when we had the second meeting of the open-ended working group way back in February last year, the recommended action came from there was that it should provide elements to the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, in particular with regard to means of implementation. Because this framework is going to be good, but if it is not implemented, then it's just going to remain on paper. And I think those are some of the lessons that is picked from the current or the previous strategic plan, where it was, people agreed on it, it looks so good, the future looks so great, then it was not funded. So it just remained like that. So there were challenges in that framework. So this is why this time around, this issue of resources for implementation, means of implementation, enabling conditions, responsibility and transparency, outreach and awareness, all this is being looked at very, very critically as we go along. But of course, there are other issues that we are going to be looking at in this framework, by safety, as well as benefit sharing. Benefit sharing is one of the issues that keeps coming up a lot in this framework as we go ahead with this development. There are other agenda items that, of course, will inform the framing of the post-2020 framework under SBI 3. Those are there: resource mobilization, financial mechanism, capacity building, technical and scientific cooperation. And I think this is where science really comes in: technology transfer, knowledge management, and so forth. So those are other elements that will be very important, other agenda items that will be very important to feed into the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, this is the theory of change as in the updated zero draft. But we are going to be working on this, and perhaps you might soon be seeing a slightly modified one that will be, enriched depending and taking on board on what we have had since that second meeting of the working group. So really, we are going to be improving on this, but basically the dream is the 2050 vision, that in 2050, we are living in harmony with nature. So the previous presentation, making peace with nature, that is a drive towards that goal, really. We are in a very worse state, but we need to live in harmony. We need to make peace with nature. So that this framework has got 2050 goals. It has got the 2030 milestones, as I'll be explaining, to really help us see whether we are making progress towards achieving those goals. And then the critical areas that we are looking at are those ecosystem and species, as well as genetic diversity, benefit sharing, human needs, and then the means of implementation. That would be broadly what is covered in that box on the 2050 goals. But to help us reach there, for now, we are looking at having 3 broad areas: on reducing threats, on meeting the needs of people, and then the tools and solutions. So our current targets are framed under those 3. And of course, means of implementation, enabling conditions, like I was explaining, responsibility and transparency, will be very critical for us to implement those targets as grouped in those 3. So when we went for the second meeting of the open-ended working group. We had 5 goals then, but after that meeting, we were told to reduce them. So we merged some of them. And the area where you see red, that is where we merged. So you'll see in the next slide that those goals have now reduced to actually 4. But also previously, we were talking about 2050 goals and 2030 goals. But from the discussion we have had to reframe that. And this time now we are talking about the 2030 milestone. So I will explain this slide in the next one. You can also see on your left, where again we had to merge target 17 and 20 because people found some similarities there. But we have still kept the targets to be 20 in total. So this is it. The current, if you look at the current updated zero draft, you'll find that in the 2050 goals, we now have 5 goals under the framework. We have got ecosystem and species diversity. There's a goal on that. And then we have got a goal that deals with meeting the needs of people, contribution of nature to the needs of people. We have a goal on benefit sharing, and then we have a goal on means of implementation. But below those goals, you will see what appears there in bullet forms. Those are now the milestones we are talking about. That, for example, I'll just give you one example under goal A. One of the milestones will be area connectivity and integrity of natural ecosystems increased by at least, again, that in bracket is what we validated by Substar, 5% by 2020. Our aim is to reach at 20%, as you are going to see later on. But by 2030, would we have reached at least 5%? That is what we want to see, whether we shall be making progress towards that. And then we shall keep looking at those milestones as we start 2031 to 2040, then 2040 to 2050. So those milestones, I can explain them later, but each goal now has got milestones under them, as you'll see there. And then when you come to the 3 categories of our action areas, the action targets. So under reducing threats, you have target 1 that will be dealing with the land use, retaining or restoration work. That was, I heard the previous speaker talking about it. You have one that is with protected areas. You have another that deals with the species recovery. This species aspect came from the outcome of the second meeting of the working group. I think we had very clear that parties or stakeholders wanted to see as a target that is talking more on species. They thought we were silent on species. So there's a target on species, there's a target on sustainable use, on invasive alien species, pollution. You had the dangerous pollution from the previous presenter, but also climate change. And then meeting the needs of people, use of species, fisheries, for example, and others, use of spaces, agriculture, you're talking about Global Biodiversity, the green cities, other regulatory services that are very vital for human health, as well, target 11, and then benefit sharing. Now, when you go to tools and solutions, that is where mainly we are talking about mainstreaming. And I really appreciate the statement that was made by the previous presenter that, when you've done mainstreaming, then the results would be the transformative change that we want to see. So 14 deals with mainstreaming into policies, planning, regulations. 15 is mainstreaming into production and supply chains. 18 is on sustainable consumption. 16 is on biosafety. And 17 is on incentives and subsidies. So much subsidies out there that is harmful to biodiversity. 18 is on resource mobilization. 19 is on traditional knowledge, available information, including, of course, traditional knowledge, and I think science comes in there. And then 20 is on IPLCs, women, youth, and girls. So that is broadly those targets that are how we have grouped them under the different areas: reducing threats, meeting needs of people, and then the other one is tools and solutions. And with, of course, what I explained earlier. So when we do all that, then we shall get into the living in harmony with nature. It's going to be a tough journey. So this is now where we begin talking more detail about the goals and the targets. Here I'm talking about goal A and goal B. I already, I think, mentioned them. I'll not explain, read them word for word. But as you see, I've told you that our goal in goal A, we want to reach by 2050 that we are at 20% 20% of natural ecosystems increased by at least 20%. The area connectivity of natural ecosystem is increased by at least 20% by 2050. And therefore, you see the breakdown of the milestones that are there. And also the number of threatened species that by a certain percentage, we shall have, again, maintained the genetic diversity of the species. So those you see in bracket is what the substar is going to help us to verify. So the milestones already talked about them, they are there. And then B is on contribution of nature to the well-being of people. Again, you're going to see here that we are saying nature has to contribute to sustainable nutrition, water, and resilience to natural disasters. The previous speaker said this very clearly, that you are talking about reducing poverty, access to water and so forth. Then degradation is going on. Really, you're not balancing this. So, but this is where we are saying if we can begin to quantify that, we would then see how nature is helping us in that direction. And then, of course, the other one is on valuing nature, looking at ecosystem services that nature provides for our well-being. So the other one is on goal C and D. This is about the benefits that is coming from the utilization of genetic resources that should be shared equitably and fairly. But the major milestone in there is that for us to go there, then equitable system for sharing benefits should be established in all countries in order for them to really see how they go about that. So that is one of the milestones there. And then the means of implementation. As I said earlier, the framework, the previous one was adopted, the strategic plan, without people thinking so much on how it was going to be resourced. But we are thinking that by 2022, which is just next door, that resources and capacity have been identified and committed to implement this framework for the period 2020 to 2030. Then by 2030 again, that resources, just like the wording in the first bullet, also will have been identified to help us implement them for the period 2030 to 2040. And so that is also going to happen for the period 2040 to 2050. So that is the thinking now, not to do one and then begin looking back on how you should resource it. So in terms of targets, I'll just be mentioning them, but not maybe reading entirely as they are. But target 1 is mainly talking about putting our land and sea areas under spatial planning. And the dream is there that at least 50% of that should be under spatial planning. But also most important that we should restore degraded areas, whether freshwater, marine, terrestrial ecosystem. Again, the percentage is there. I had the previous speaker saying we have to restore nature. Surely we have to do that. Then target 2 is mainly dealing about protected areas. And this is where there is the talk about the 30 by 30. And I think this is generating a lot of momentum. Target, that was target 2. Target 3 is mainly dealing with management of wild species of fauna and flora, and also reducing the human-wildlife conflict by a certain percentage there. Target 4 mainly deals with ensuring that harvesting or use of wild species of fauna and flora are sustainable, but also they are legal and safe. And then target 5, this mainly deals about management of invasive species. Invasive species still remains a problem to biodiversity, and we are saying that at least by having 50% of those priority areas well managed and not having these impacts as we have it today, then we could have done a good job. Target 6 deals with the pollution. Really, you heard about this. I will not explain much about it. And we are talking about really reducing pollution from all sources. Target 7 is on really looking at the contribution of biodiversity to mitigation, to mitigating the adverse impacts of climate change, to ensuring adaptation, as well as disaster risk reduction. So that is target 7. And target 7, of course, deals with a new concept, which is, would I call it new, or one of the concepts that is gaining momentum now, that is the aspect of nature-based solution. Target 8 is on ensuring that benefits, including benefits from nutrition, food security, health, which is for the well-being of people, that those ones, we should be able to achieve that through sustainable management of wild species and fauna. Target 9 is on productivity. We are talking about ensuring resilience and sustainability in agrobiodiversity. And I think this is the other target that is going to be important because as the population of the world increases, still food production will be an issue. Everybody needs to be fed, but how is that going to happen? Target 10, this is on about ensuring that nature-based solution and ecosystem approach contribute to regulation of air quality, hazards, extreme events. So this almost again expands a little bit more on the issue of contribution of nature to adverse effects of climate change. Target 11, this is about benefit sharing from the green spaces. Cities should be greener as we move towards 2030, 2040, 2050, and not necessarily keep reducing the green spaces in cities, because greener cities, we believe people will be more healthy living there than very hot cities. Target 12, this deals with the sharing of benefits arising from utilization of genetic resources. I talked about that. If you go to the next slide. Target 13, again, this is basically about mainstreaming. I touched on that. I may not have to explain a lot. Target 14, this is about subsidies. We want to reduce those negative subsidies by at least 50%. Hope we can make inroads there. Target 15 is eliminating unsustainable consumption patterns, practices. Is that something we can see happening in practice? We believe that could really help us a lot in achieving the vision of living in harmony with nature, because there's a lot of waste when it comes to consumption here. Target 16 deals with managing and preventing the potential negative or adverse impacts of biotechnology on biodiversity and human health, and reducing those impacts by a certain percentage that will be determined in the targets. Then target 17, this deals with the subsidies, repurposing, redirecting those harmful subsidies to benefit biodiversity conservation. Again, there are still figures there that will have to be worked on. Target 18 deals with the financial resources, that it should increase by a certain percentage, again, from all sources, domestic, international. We would like to see this increasing. And remember, I just told you about our dream of having by 2022 resources available for the first phase of implementing this framework. And then target 19, this deals with about information, and we think also traditional knowledge can contribute to that. This should be able to make decision makers, better aware in terms of the impact that their decision could result into when it comes to biodiversity, but also in that case for them to make better decisions with availability of information, but also research and education. And I think science comes in here, research. A lot of the work that was presented today, I think, is based on the outcomes of research. Then target 20 is to ensure equitable participation in decision making. And we're talking about diversity of stakeholders here, IPLCs, women, youth, girls, all of us should be involved. Now, I'll just give this an example, the indicators. So how are we thinking about aspects of indicators? I said earlier that most of the indicators, we are going to validate them during the Substar 24th meeting. But for now, if you look at target 1, where we're saying that by 2030, 50% of the land and sea areas globally are under spatial planning, addressing land, stock, sea use change, returning most of the existing intact wilderness areas, and allowing, of course, for a percentage in bracket to be restored. So we are thinking, first of all, that under that, we should have what we are calling components here, that you have, in general, increase in area of terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystem under spatial planning. Those are the components under target 1. Now, what are the monitoring elements that we're thinking of? 1 is trends in area under spatial land use plans, and 2 is trends in area in integrated coastal zone management, and the other one is trend in area under marine planning. So those are some of the monitoring elements. But what are the indicators now that we are thinking of? And you can get more of all of this from the monitoring framework that we have at the moment, which addresses all these targets. I was just picking an example here. Now look at the indicators we are proposing. 1, that it should be looking at the proportion of transboundary basin areas with an operational arrangement for water cooperation. So the period we are thinking of in terms of baseline data that's available, that is 2017, because people have been asking, if you are talking about baseline, which year are we thinking about? So we are thinking 2017. But also what you've done, and you're going to see it when you read the monitoring framework, the draft monitoring framework, is that we also try to link them to the SDG. Which SDG does that indicator talk to? So we've tried to do that. Then the other one is on the number of countries using ecosystem-based approaches to manage or in managing marine areas. So that is SDG indicator number 1421. So this is how we have tried to move with the indicators. We identify the indicators. We look at the indicators in the SDGs as well that talks to this. So that is how you'll see those. So now as I turn towards the end, let's look at the implementation support mechanism and perhaps the role of the science policy interface. When you talk about capacity development, capacity building, resource mobilization, knowledge generation, all this, we need science to give us information on. Even resource mobilization, people ask you questions. Why do you need so much money? If you cannot really give scientific information sometimes to justify that, they'll just say you are doing guesswork. So science is going to cut across. Technology, scientific cooperation, technology transfer, innovation, which is needed to implement this framework, science has a role there. Inclusive and integrative governance, mainstreaming biodiversity in all sectors. Even when you are mainstreaming, you still need science. Even when you're talking about governance, you still need science to prove what poor governance could have caused, what amount of loss could have resulted from poor governance or governance that is not pro-biodiversity. And then for that case, science will help us to know that. Then traditional knowledge I talked about, that. Gender, of course, the other issue that comes out very clearly in this, gender responsiveness, but not forgetting, of course, the other groups, the women, the IPLCs, and so forth. Then synergies among the other MEAs. That is something we are going to be looking at when think science has a role to play, but also linking this to the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. I think that was it from me. Sorry if I've taken a bit of time, but I needed to try to explain to you so that those who are hearing maybe this for the first time try to get something of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to our keynote speaker for those realistic, inspiring, and interesting presentations. We have now come to the end of session 1, part 1. So we will have to address all the questions in writing. We want to thank our keynote speakers for your participation and willingness to attend this session, and all of you for your active participation. Now, Claudio Chiarola from the CBD Secretariat will present some instructions regarding the second part of the session.
Yes, good day, colleagues. I hope you can hear me. So as Sergio just mentioned, the questions that have been posted in the Zoom tab will be addressed and considered by the panelists. They can do so in writing during the length of this session in the Q&A tab, and as soon as the questions are responded, they become visible to everyone, both the question and the response. For those questions that are not answered during this live session, they will be reposted on the forum website, and such virtual space will remain open for 3 days after the end of each session to give an opportunity for the panelists and attendees to consider the remaining questions and for the online discussion to continue. So thank you very much to all of you who have been posting and contributing to this debate.